It's purple jam time, so here I've got frozen cherry plums, Bullaces, Elderberries and Blackberries, which I've picked in their respective seasons. And these are all frozen, but they'll cook from frozen. We're going to make some purple jam. In today's video, we're going to be making this. This is my purple jam. I'm making this to replenish the purple jam that I made a couple of years ago, which is now run out. This video is quite long because I've tried to explain a lot of things that people commonly ask about jam making and my whole process. But this video has chapters, so do feel free to use those. If you find that I'm talking too much and you want to skip to the next bit, the chapters are there for that precise reason. This is going to be a seedless jam, so I need to strain the elderberries and blackberries. The plums have already been destoned. And at this stage, I'm not weighing or measuring anything because I'm going to measure the juice that we get out of this. So elderberries first. Okay, that's enough. I've put a tiny splash of water in that and I'll heat those to thaw them and stew them down to a pulp. Meanwhile, here's past shrimp with a few musings on elderberries. Elderberries will need a little bit of a wash because of the method of picking. When I pick blackberries, I pick them individually and quite judiciously. When I pick elderberries, because they are tiny little fruits, I tend to just hold a shallow container underneath the bunch and roll them off. That means we get all sorts of other things in there, including this lovely little spider, which we'll just go and put in the garden. Where was I? By the way, I'm not here to tell you not to wash things that you pick. If you want to, generally don't bother with blackberries, because I pick them in a way that I find is sufficiently clean for my tastes. Not so with elderberries, because I have to kind of just do this massaging thing with the bush. So these, we drop into a big container of water, give them a little swirl around, and all of the stuff that's not good floats up. And that's lots of little bits of detritus and possibly any berries that are unripe or have got a bug in them. It wouldn't matter too much if I didn't take this out because the jam I'm going to make is going to be sieved and strained anyway, but I can just skim the top and remove bits of twig and leaf and unripe berries and insects and anything else that's floating. Most of the stuff you don't want is floating, and the reason for that is because the specific gravity of the fruits is greater than water, because the fruits are full of sugar. They're basically heavier than water. They're more dense than water. So when they're ripe, they sink, which is very convenient. So there we go. Beautiful, clean, ripe elderberries. Now, the other reason for washing these actually is that elderberries, I find sometimes when they're really ripe, they have quite a lot of yeast on the skins. That's great if you want to make wine, but I find sometimes the sheer amount of yeast that can be on these fruit can impart a kind of slightly cheesy flavour to the jam. So giving them a little rinse like that is probably a good idea from a flavour standpoint. Now you can pick the entire bunch of elderberries and then back at home strip them off the strigs with a fork like this. I didn't do that for a couple of reasons. One is that I actually had to walk quite far afield to pick my elderberries, and I didn't really want to be carrying a whole lot of bunches of them home. It's just more bulky carry home if I had to bring back a sack of unnecessary twigs. The other one is that if they're unevenly ripened, which is often the case with bunches of elderberries, then you'd be picking them quite indiscriminately and there'd be a lot of waste. So if you've got a bunch that's got only some ripened berries on it and you pick the whole bunch, then you're wasting all of those unripe fruits and depriving birds and other people of the opportunity to have those later. So I prefer to roll them off the bunches in the field straight into the container, as you saw me doing earlier, because that way only the ripe fruits tend to roll off and you end up with a lot less wastage. Similarly with the frozen blackberries, I think we'll use all of those and we'll get that stewed down at the same time as the elderberries. Now the reason these look red is because they're frozen. When I picked these, they were very ripe and dark, and whenever you freeze blackberries, I think because the inside of each little druplet almost turns to sorbet. And if you think about a sorbet, it's often a lighter colour than the fruit it's made from. Anyway, yeah, I think we'll have a few more blackberries in there. So the elderberries have already released a lot of juice. Blackberries have got a bit of catching up to do, but that will happen presently. So I'll turn those down and we'll simmer that for a little while. So the role of each individual fruit in here is interesting. Elderberries don't have a great deal of flavour on their own, certainly not so much as blackberries, but they do have a wonderful aroma and also colour. They're very, very richly coloured, so they will add aroma and colour and a little bit of texture as well to the jam, because they've got this very syrupy, jammy texture to them. I assume that's pectin or something like that. So the blackberries are still going, but the elderberries are now ready for sieving. And a lot of the juice is just draining out without any encouragement. But what I'm going to do now is just force these through the sieve like this with the back of a large spoon. This is quite a laborious process, and some people use a moulie for this. I've tried various moulies and I always find that they get jammed up with the seeds. Not so much with elderberries, but with blackberries, the woody seeds seem to jam up moulies, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Other people have had success with them. I've tried them and failed, so sieve always works for me. I think maybe these could have been cooked a bit longer and we'd get more pulp, but it's the juice of the elderberries that I'm really interested in. All of the stones and seeds that I'm sieving out here these will go in the compost. They will rot down. They won't grow because they've been boiled. The stones from the plums, which we'll talk about in a minute, were viable when I took them out, so those have been scattered in our woodland, in our little patch of woodland, so hopefully we might get some cherry plum trees growing. So I can get you right down to the action here. As I'm squeezing these through the sieve, you can see there's juice running out into the jug. So that's the yield on the elderberry juice. Just to have a little taste. My fingers are going to end up indelibly stained at the end of all of this. So not a lot of fruity flavour. There's a slight acidity, and there is an aroma to elderberries, a quite floral almost aroma, but it's the blackberries where the real fruitiness comes from. And speaking of blackberries, here's what those are up to. They've cooked down to a pulp. They're still not quite soft enough yet, so I'm going to stew them for a little bit longer until the fruits have all broken down completely. I haven't got a segment about picking blackberries because I did that in a very recent video, so if you want a little bit of background on picking and enjoying blackberries, that's in this card and a link in the video description. Alright, same thing now with the blackberries. I haven't bothered to wash the sieve from the elderberries because it's going to get stained anyway. So the blackberry pulp now, which is nicely broken down, is going to go in there. And again, we've already got juice running through all on its own. But again, I'll encourage it through the sieve with the spoon. We will get a higher yield of juice from this than we did from the elderberries, just because these fruits are very much more juicy and pulpy than elderberries were. What I'm doing here is similar to what a moulie would do, but it's not as forceful, and so it takes a bit more effort, but the little woody seeds don't jam the sieve because I'm riding the spoon over the top of them. And I'll just keep on doing that until this pulp starts to feel or look dry, at which point we'll be dealing with mostly seeds and a few little bits of pith, and we can stop and put the next batch in. The slightly larger pieces in there, in case you're wondering, is like the core of the blackberry. So raspberries, that core comes away and stays on the stalk, on the plant. Blackberries, the core of the fruit stays with the fruit. There's still pulp coming through, so I'll keep going. Right, I think that's about it for that, so I'll just get rid of that bit of pulp. Now you might be thinking, why not use the back of the ladle to press it through the sieve? You can do that with, I think, with deeper sieves than this, but when I've tried that in the past, what tends to happen is all of the pulp and seeds rides up the sides of the sieve and eventually drops into the container, into the vessel underneath. So the spoon here is doing the same action, So if I'm sieving all the seeds out, am I making jelly? Good question. The answer is no. There is a legal definition for jam and jelly. The legal definitions only really matter if you're selling it or if you're going to exhibit it at a country fair. But I'm making seedless jam. Jelly would be made from the juice of the fruit, which we would stew it down. We'd put it in a cloth bag and let it drip. So the clear juice that comes out naturally from that process. I'm forcibly straining this, so I'm getting the juice as well as the pulp. And of course my jam's going to have whole pieces of plum in it, minus their stones. So it's a seedless jam rather than a jelly. The purposes of spreading toast, those definitions are moot. You know, make what you like, enjoy what you made. I suppose one question to answer here is why not just leave the seeds in? And I think for some jams I don't mind the seeds. Strawberry jam, the seeds are not problematic at all. Raspberries and blackberries tend to have quite woody little seeds. And for me at least, those seeds are just a little bit bigger than the gaps in between my teeth and get jammed in there in an interference fit. And somewhere in the world there'll be somebody who enjoys the process of picking out blackberry or raspberry seeds from their teeth. That person's not me. So there's a lot of effort involved here in straining these things, but it is preferable for me to the discomfort and effort of picking blackberry seeds out of my teeth. So there's the final yield. For the elderberries we got about a 40% yield. For the blackberries we got probably about a 55-60% yield of pulp. So in total about 50% of what we processed is usable pulp and juice. So that's the messiest and least pleasant part done. So now I'm going to put these plums in. These are still frozen. This is the vessel I'm going to use for cooking the jam. So I've got 1578 grams of plums. Here's past shrimp on cherry plums. I picked these. Here there's probably about 3 kilos of cherry plums. What are cherry plums? We'll talk about that in a moment. But these will need a wash because some of these I picked up off the ground. So I've sanitised the sink. We've just got cold water in here. And those are all going to go in there. Probably discard any that float. Get all the bits of leaf and everything off. So, what are cherry plums? There are several species of small plums in the UK. There's something called mirabelles, and then there are small cherry plums, and these are notionally different species. But wherever I've seen them growing, you end up with a continuum of intermediate types. Let's just get a little array of those. So I don't actually think that we've got 2 distinct species here. I think we've got a whole load of different hybrids. But yeah, they cross with each other, and whenever I find them, I always find a mixture of all of these different colours and sizes. These are quite small. We have had a tremendous fruit set for these plums this year, mainly because there was no frost at blossom time. Plum trees have, when they blossom, it's often around about that time of the year, we get a few little late frosts and it just destroys the embryo fruit as soon as they're pollinated. Or it just keeps all the bees at home and they don't get pollinated at all. That didn't happen this year. We had a nice warm spring with no late frosts, and so there has been a phenomenal fruit set of cherries and plums. Most often you'll encounter these alongside a road, and it's not a good place to pick them. The reason for that is people generally tend to think that's because somebody threw a plum stone out of a window of a car, but with these it's more likely that somebody planted a hedge and they bought some hedging plants in, bare root hedging plants in, which tends to be a mixture of blackthorn, hawthorn and cherry plum, and maybe a few other things like viburnum as well. So I'm going to make blackberry, elderberry and plum jam, mixed fruit, but the elderberries aren't quite ready yet. So I'm going to prepare these plums and then freeze them without the stones in. So preparing these is probably going to be a bit laborious, and it comprises slitting them around like that. Fruit goes in one container, stone goes in the other. Not all of them will be as simple as that to get the stones out. Sometimes you'll find with these, the fruit clings to the stone, much like you have cling peaches and freestone peaches. If we're lucky, these will all be the freestone type of plums. They do look pretty good. So I will collect up all the stones because I'm going to plant these. Now, probably what I should do here is take a handful. Do all of the slitting as one job, and then I'm not picking up and putting down the knife all the time. So yeah, just for a little bit of efficiency here, to save having to put down and pick up the knife all the time, I'll slit a load of them like this, and then I'll stop and split them. The other advantage of stoning them now means that I can weigh them and I can calculate the amount of sugar I need to add to my jam based on the amount of fruit without the stones. Right, so that's the yield, and that's really not bad. And those are the stones and a few duff fruits. Those I'll take and, as I say, scatter in the woodland. I'll push some of them into the soil, and hopefully we'll get 1 or 2 plum trees growing in our little bit of woodland. But that lot of prepared plums is just going to go in a bag in the freezer now. Now I've also got these Bullaces. These have been in the freezer for just a couple of days because I was waiting to pick them as the last ingredient for this jam. Anyway, here's past shrimp with some wittering about Bullaces and damsons. I've been waiting for this to happen. The Bullaces are now ripe. So these are Bullaces, type of small plum. Very similar to damsons. In fact, the same thing as damsons, really. And this is the final ingredient I've been waiting for to be ripe. They ripen a little bit later than regular plums, sometimes weeks later. So I'm going to give these a good wash, and then I'm going to slice them open, get the stones out, and then we'll make some purple jam. So, Bullaces. So what are Bullaces? This is confusing because Bullaces, are they the same thing as damsons or sloes? Kind of yes and no. So, damsons, now let's start at the beginning. Plums. The regular varieties of plums are usually a species called Prunus domestica. Damsons are a subspecies of Prunus domestica called Institia. Oh gosh, these aren't separating very easily at all. That's going to be fun. That's not good. I may end up just only getting the skins off of these. Anyway, so, and then Bullaces are the same thing as damsons. They're just a different variety of damson that tends to grow small spherical fruits. Well, this is not going well. The stones are rather clinging to the fruit flesh. That's still okay because really it's the colour from the skins that I want for my purple jam. I'm getting some of the flesh on those. Anyway, so yeah, where was I? Plums, Prunus domestica. Damsons, Prunus domestica subspecies Institia. Bullaces, same thing, but physically just a smaller variety of damsons. Sloes are Prunus spinosa, so related, but not the same thing. So sloes are a different species of little plums from domestic plums and from the subspecies of plums that are damsons and Bullaces, but they do crossbreed, and they do like the same sorts of conditions actually. So Bullaces and sloes you'll find in hedgerows, and they like very similar conditions. And so I quite often find things that I'm not very sure whether it's a Bullace or a sloe, and the reason is probably that it's a hybrid. Okay, well that was messy and unpleasant and uncomfortable, but we got about like a 50% yield of fruit, kind of fruit pulp and skins there. So it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. The reason I'm weighing this is because I need to add sugar in proportion to the fruit. So my elderberry juice takes us up to 2.442 kilos, and my blackberry juice. I hope this is not going to max out the scales. Just going to go around with a spatula. There's no point wasting the sieve juice at this point. 3853. Right, remember 3853. Or, you know, write it down. So I've got frozen cherry plums and Bullaces in here, plus the warm elderberry and blackberry juice. I've actually got some other things to do, so I'm just going to leave that to sit now, and those two opposing temperatures will equalise out and keep it until I'm ready for the next bit. So in a moment we're going to add sugar to that mixture and then boil it down to make the jam. But first, just a brief description of the hygiene process here. I've got 12 jars prepared. I'm going to sterilise the jars by putting them upside down on a tray in the oven like this. They'll be heated up to 160 Celsius, well above the temperature where any pathogens can survive, and they'll be held at that temperature for 20 minutes or so. My jam funnel can also go into the oven because that's made of metal and it's non-stick. The lids cannot, because they've got a little rubber seal inside of there which would just melt. So the lids will go into a jug which I'll fill with boiling water. I might put a couple of drops of Milton in there as well just to sterilise those. In case you're wondering, the reason the jars are upside down like this is that when I take them out of the oven and they start to cool, I will one by one take them, fill them, cap them, and that minimises the opportunity for spoilage organisms to get in there. Any little stray mould spores or bacteria that do happen to get in while we're filling the jars will be killed by the fact that we're filling it with boiling hot jam. The jar is already hot, the lid's going to be sterile going on, and it will stay hot for quite a while after capping, and that will kill off anything that's left in there. Plus the fact that the jam has quite a high sugar content and also is acidic, which in itself will inhibit things like botulism. So over here at the cooker, I'm just going to bring that to a boil now, that jam mixture. There is not a lot of headspace in the pan here, and I've got to add the sugar still. And I'm going to add sugar to 50% of the weight of the fruit. 3.853 kilograms of fruit in there, so 1.926 kilograms of sugar to go in. So that's 1 kilo already in there. This might seem like a lot of sugar, but in jam terms, this is actually quite a low sugar jam. This is quite a high fruit to sugar ratio. We could be running into trouble here because when it boils, it might bubble over. So it might be that I have to decant some of this out and boil it in a separate vessel. As I rather expected, I had to decant that into 2 different vessels just because this is not big enough to boil this jam in. So it's in my 2 largest pans. One day I must invest in a larger preserving pan. But for now we've got this. That does enable me to put the rest of my sugar in. So I've got 926 grams of sugar here. I'm going to put about half of it, a little bit over half of it in there, and a little bit less than half of it in there. Now, boiling in 2 different vessels like this, we could end up with different mixtures because that wasn't very precise, that addition of sugar. But we can easily overcome that. All we have to do to ensure homogeneity between these 2 different pans is to exchange ladlefuls of the mixture back and forth like that. Just do that repeatedly, and eventually these 2 mixtures will equalise in composition. So these are almost coming to the boil now, and as I say, I have been exchanging ladlefuls of the mixture from one to the other like this, by which we end up with as good as a properly homogenised mixture across the 2 batches. This has to come to the boil. It's almost at the boil now. This has to be done with the lids off because we are reducing this to concentrate the sugars. And then I'm going to measure the temperature with a probe and boil until we get to 104 degrees Celsius, because what we're indirectly measuring there is the concentration of sugar, because when the sugar, as the moisture is driven off, the sugar concentration goes up, the boiling point goes up. And so once we hit 104 Celsius, that means the sugar is sufficiently concentrated that in conjunction with the pectin from the fruit, that will set the jam. Also during that process, these plums will cook, because at the moment the plums are still kind of raw. And I imagine what will happen there is that these golden plums, the mirabelles or not mirabelles, whichever you prefer, will take on the purple colour of the jam itself. Okay, everything is proceeding at pace. The jars are in the oven sterilising, the lids are in the hot water and Milton bath sterilising, The jam is boiling now hard, so let's monitor the temperature, see what we got. So we're up to 102, nearly 103. There is, when you boil jam, especially these sorts of jams, there is this kind of frothy stuff that you get around the edges. Some people like to skim this off. If you're making jelly for a show, you definitely need to skim that off because that will lose your points. If you're making this kind of jam, I mean, you could skim that off, but I tend to do that. If you're going to do that, do it right at the end, because otherwise more of it will form and you just end up wasting most of your jam. It's just froth that's been created by a conjunction of the sugar and I think some of the fibre in the fruit. There's no point taking it off at the moment or else more will form. Or perhaps it won't. Perhaps I'm wrong about that. So I've skimmed the froth off of this one and put it into there just for now. We'll see if any more froth forms on the right hand pan. So yeah, a little bit more of that frothy scum has formed on this pan. So that does vindicate my intuition on this, that you're better off just leaving that until the end. And if you want to skim it off in one go. Not because, I don't think because you'll have more of it in total, but because every time you skim this jam, you're going to waste a little bit of the actual jam. You might as well just do that once. Now, when I probed these just a moment ago, they're up to 103.5, so we're getting close. That is 103.5 degrees Celsius. That's above the boiling point of water. So this will burn you instantly. Worse than that, it will stick to you because it's all sugary, syrupy stuff. So the sink behind me is filled with cold water. Just in case I get a splash of it on my skin, I can plunge my hand straight into cold water. So these jars are out of the oven now, and at the moment, too hot to touch. So I'm leaving them upside down. I'm going to let them cool a little bit because we don't, when we put the jam in, I don't want the jam to boil when it hits the jar. And I don't want even though the jam is really hot, I don't want it to shock the jars and crack them. So ideally, these jars will cool down to about the same temperature as the jam. They're upside down, so the insides will stay relatively sterile. Right, these are both now at 104. So now I'm going to skim this stuff off. But this is not going to go to waste. This, I remember my grandma giving us this stuff as a treat with ice cream. It is just foamy jam. And when it's cooled down, it will set and it will have a kind of marshmallowy texture almost. Right, so here's the process. Jars are just about cool enough to handle. Jam funnel goes on, boiling hot jam goes in. I'll try and fill nice and full, certainly up above the shoulder of the jar. Jam funnel into the next jar to avoid mess. Lid straight on and done up tight. And that's it. So that jar's now scalding hot inside. Anything that's alive in there won't be alive for long. And that's the idea. Now, some people turn the jars upside down so that the scalding hot jam can seal and kill off anything that might have been in the top there. I've never found that necessary, and it's a bit messy when you open them, so I won't be doing that. I'm going to turn the camera off now. Back in a moment when it's all done. All right, job done. That's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9.5 jars of purple jam. I suppose if I'd filled them a little less generously individually, we might have gone to 10 jars. 2 jars unused. It's always good to over provision. My shirt is a mess. The kitchen is a mess. Gonna have a clean up and then we'll take stock of where we got to. However, before we get too carried away with cleaning, a little sneaky taste. Well, I can already see that this jam is going to set well because it's already gone sticky in the pan as it's cooled down here. A little taste of scraping from the pan. Nice. It's got a good acidity. So keeping the sugar content minimal means that the fruit content is higher and the natural acidity of the fruit isn't overwhelmed by sugar. That's really nice. It's a nice sour hedgerow jam. So this stuff that we skimmed off the top of the jam is now set. Like I say, it's got this kind of weird marshmallowy, almost like chewy sweets, you know, like those foamy banana sweets. Tastes really good. So I think what I'm going to do is have a bit of that in there and a bit of yogurt. Probably just mix it, but not completely. There we go. It's really nice. Kind of like a fruit corner or something like that, but better. So the next morning we have some jars of jam. Now we're going to do a taste test in a minute. Actually, a taste test on toast. A toast taste test in a minute. Here is the jam the next morning, and it's just set. Now, this jam, last time I made it, took a week to fully set. But this is actually not a bad set right now. You know, it'll run if I tip it, but it has gelled in there. This is the advantage of using a digital thermometer for measuring the set point, is that you can boil it more than this if you want, and you'll get a really firm set. But if you stop at 104 or 104.5, then the jam just sets so that it's ever such a delicate gel, and I like that. Okay, time for a taste test. So I've got 2 halves of a lightly toasted, forked, ancient grain muffin. The butter is straight out of the fridge, so we'll just give that a moment to melt. Okay, and here we go with purple jam. So look at that, it's ever so delicate. I think we might have a little bit more on there. It will set a bit further than that over the coming days. That's quite a generous amount of jam on there, but why not? And it's got all the skins of the plums in there. Damson and plum jam with the skins in it. I love the way the skins turn into little chewy pieces of confectionery in the jam. Anyway, here we go. It's really good. I'm really happy with that. It's got a lovely little bit of tangy acidity. The jammy sweetness of the elderberries and plums and blackberries definitely comes through. That hedgerow aroma of the blackberries and the delicate perfume of the elderberries is all there. I'm really happy with that, and that'll hopefully keep me stocked with purple jam for another year or two. Of course, we can't forget the toast tax, and it's breakfast in bed for Eva this morning. There you go, it's a little bit with no jam on it. So all that remains now is to label these and get these stored away in the cupboard, and this should last me a couple of years until the next time. So that was Purple Jam 2025. I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.